Thank you all for being here to talk about this very important topic. I wish we could have a full day for this. I'll just introduce our first two panelists, Senator Heidi Heitkamp from North Dakota, currently working on a project at Harvard on
the real state of the union.
The real state of the union, and Congresswoman Haley Stevens from Michigan. Thank you. Thanks. So I'm going to let each of you just give a few remarks about this topic and what you have seen in your home states and in your districts. Then we'll go from there.
Great. I'm happy to start. Haley Stevens from southeastern Michigan. I can't but help say that I'm so glad that Al Fitzpain's mother is here, because I have had the privilege of working on and off with Mr. Fitzpain for the last decade. First at the Treasury Department, where I served as Chief of Staff on the U.S. Auto Rescue, the initiative responsible for saving General Motors and Chrysler and 200,000 Michigan jobs and millions more. I can't talk about the future of work without talking about politics. So allow me to get a little political with you. I'm a Democrat. I won a seat, a suburban congressional seat in November that hasn't been held by a Democrat since before we landed on the moon. And a big theme of what I did in this district, my guiding light, was advanced manufacturing and the workforce. And so I taped up a little banner, on my campaign office wall that someone gave to me when I was working in the Treasury Department that said, "It's the manufacturing economy, stupid." and that's truly, in part for me, what motivated me to throw my hat in the ring to run for Congress. I, following from the Obama administration, worked in an advanced manufacturing research lab, a digital manufacturing institute focused on the future of work in the digital age. And I had this enormous charge of creating workforce development initiatives to meet the workforce development demands, when really some of the world's top economists were saying all these jobs are going to go away. That digitization and automation is changing work so rapidly that we really should be preparing for the worst. But what I found when I was working in this research lab with companies like Autodesk and Siemens and Lockheed Martin and John Deere, crawling around factory floors, sitting in boardrooms, was that the jobs aren't going away, they're changing. And that we need public policymakers to prioritize how we address and guide through that change. So now that I have this seat in Congress, I worked very hard when I got there to get two appointments. One was on the House Education and Labor Committee, and the other was on the House Science, Space, and Technology Committee. And as somebody who spent their career working with the National Institute of Standards and Technologies, the supply chain on these workforce development issues, along with the National Science Foundation, I'm proud to share I'm also the subcommittee chair for research and technology that oversees those two entities. And it's a great fusion for how we can have this conversation around the future of work. Because your elected officials, we're really your change management officers. And it's our responsibility to guide our populations through the change that we're living through.
Thank you.
Let's first start out and put it in kind of some kind of perspective from the workers' standpoint and from the overall economic standpoint, and then I'll talk a little bit about North Dakota. So the workers' standpoint, think politically about where the American worker is. The person who doesn't maybe have a PhD, doesn't have a professional job. They have insecurity, huge insecurity. They haven't saved for retirement. They don't know that their kids can afford college, even though they've been told over and over again that a 4-year degree is a path to success economically in this country. And they're terrified by three things. They're terrified by globalization, because they equate that with loss of economic opportunity. They're terrified by immigration, because they believe that that's competitors in the workforce that don't belong here. And they're terrified by automation. Less terrified by automation because they've experienced automation. I mean, my dad, who grew up on a farm in North Dakota, started farming with horses. And eventually, it's probably not the same as being a medical librarian, but he hated horses his whole life because he had to deal with them, right? But he had one message to us as we were growing up. If you're working with a machine, you keep the machine working, because the machine's more efficient than you are. And if you want to be as efficient as what you can, that machine is critically important to efficiency. So I think automation, it scares people because they don't know what it is. And then you overlay another buzzword, artificial intelligence. Now, doesn't that sound scary to the average American worker? We have not made these issues accessible. And the other reason why we have challenges and disparate ideas about what we do is because we have not had a conversation about what economic opportunities exist within a world. And let me tell you, you're not going to stop automation. I mean, let's just not even go there. You're not going to stop artificial intelligence. Right now, the Chinese are investing outrageous amounts of money to become dominant in AI. We need to amp up. We need to amp up our automation. We need to amp up our artificial intelligence investments if we're going to be successful. But we need to bring the population along. Why is it hard to pass trade agreements? I mean, this should be a no-brainer. We're less than 5% of global population. We've got to be engaged in trade, and we've got to be engaged in a very robust and smart way. But we're held back by an ideology that trade agreement is going to somehow injure American workers. We have to put American workers front row and center. So let's switch over to the idea of macroeconomics. How many of you think that we will achieve anywhere near 3% growth if we don't embrace automation and if we don't improve working opportunities? Productivity is absolutely critical. Guess what? The number one statistic that I look at in terms of looking at economic growth in this country, workforce participation. People are underemployed and people aren't coming into the workforce. Why is that? Because they can't afford to be workers. They can't afford daycare. They can't afford the training. And so what are we doing to provide opportunity to increase workforce participation and grow the economy? What are we doing to address the investment in human capital? We talk about 179 tax code provision to expense for small business. Do we talk about expensing and giving the absolute same treatment to workforce development programs? No, we missed a huge opportunity in that tax bill to address a lot of these systemic concerns. Al, I'm great. I read your recommendations. They're spot on. But we need to have a political will to actually get those done. Now I'm just going to talk a little bit about North Dakota. The number one challenge in North Dakota for business is workforce. You know, we used to, when we did economic development in rural America, we used to say, oh, if Marvin Windows comes in and builds a factory in Grafton, you know, they will come, the workers will come. When I was traveling around looking at economic development and rural challenges in North Dakota, there were very many primary sector jobs that were going unfilled. Why? Well, number one, this challenge of living in rural America, people don't want to live there a lot of times. I always say you gotta, it's the Netflix test. Can they stream Netflix in your community if you're going to get a workforce? Technology. But it also is the lack of skills and skill-based training that it's easier to change tires down at the tire store than it is to integrate. And one last story, and it's a story about the Painters Union in Minneapolis. Okay, glazers, huge. You can imagine, you just heard from the AutoCAD guys how important, you know, getting skill sets for innovation in construction. They have now redesigned their union to become a training union. They do some of the state-of-art training, and they are embracing automation. Instead of having 5 guys lift a window pane, they have automation. And then what do we expect that glazer to do as we're installing the glass? And those are the kinds of transition points to work with people who represent working people, to work with people who are designing systems in the tax code, to work with people and then communicate to the American workforce, we got your back. We aren't going to let you become a casualty and be stuck in a minimum wage job. If you meet us halfway with your talent and your ability and your desire to change, but we've got to tell people what direction it is. We've got to be absolutely, if we want economic growth, if we want trade policies that make sense, if we want automation that makes sense, then we've got to explain and be willing to do everything that we can to make sure that the American workers benefits as a result.
I want to go to Congresswoman Stevens. We heard a little bit about how some of these changes are impacting North Dakota. In your district, which has a lot of manufacturing traditionally, you talked about how most jobs are not disappearing, but they're changing. Where do you see automation changing jobs? How are they evolving? And what does that mean for the workforce in your district?
Well, first you have to take it to the individual. You have to take it local. Talking about these things, which it's important to do on a macro level, doesn't work unless you really take a microscope or a magnifying glass to what is happening neighborhood by neighborhood. I represent the country's most robust automotive supply chain. We are home to dozens and dozens of automotive suppliers, hundreds as a matter of fact, but I speak of my dozens right on the I-75 corridor. Just as you're driving by, you see them over and over again. Why is this significant? 10 years ago, we had the largest drop in automotive sales in the history of the automobile. An entire industry was staring liquidation in the face. There was double-digit unemployment. It wasn't just for sale signs in front of people's homes. It was mass foreclosure. Now, in my district today, we are responsible for 75% of the R&D in autonomous vehicle technology. 2-to-1 patents in autonomous are coming right out of Michigan's 11th district. I love it because Silicon Valley's knocking on our door. A place called Wixom, home to about 70,000 people, also home to the shuttered Ford Lincoln plant that closed in 2007. You can't buy a home in Wixom today, because there's so much competition. There's multiple industrial parks employing people in these spaces, in startups that just came about because unemployed auto engineers started crafting in their basements. And so as we look at this question about how is automation and digitization manifesting in a place like Michigan, make no mistake about it. We're leading the way, but we're leading the way through the human capital and talent that we have in our region. And it's not just the engineers who are fabulous and our automotive executives. It's something that the senator just mentioned. It's our auto unions. So if your public policymakers are going to play a role, which we intend to in this future of work conversation, we really are going to play it through placing a value on the work and saying that your role matters. And we have to start talking about a 21st century labor movement. The great state of Michigan is now a right-to-work state. We're going to change that. Okay, but the other thing is that 14% of our workforce is unionized. 10% of the nation's workforce is unionized. Why are unions important as it pertains to this conversation? There's a lot of change happening. There's a lot of millennials who are saying, I like the idea of union, but I don't have a pathway to get into a union or to get into an apprenticeship program. When you look at some of the best practices, I was just at our IBEW, our Electric Workers Apprenticeship Training Program Center, and it's remarkable what they're doing, and it's all paid for. They pay for it themselves. It's self-fulfilling. Our Department of Labor isn't even involved because they're doing it right. And so when we look at the spectrum of how we're going to catalyze programs and inspire the next generation, we also have to be really focused on the delivery, which is that there's a future workforce and that there's an existing workforce. And the on-the-job training is paramount. Our big guys can do it in droves. Our large OEMs can do on-the-job training in droves. We gotta get to our suppliers. We gotta get to our small and mid-sized manufacturers. You've heard it before. Digitize or die, export or die, job train. or not, or don't succeed. That's the next wave here. So how do we answer that? Well, we're doing it through support around AI, as the senator was talking about, as well as new approaches to workforce development and access to capital for our small and mid-sized manufacturers who just need a little bit of wiggle room to start to do some of that training.
You both have talked about the importance of the federal government in this, but the US has not had a very strong industrial policy when it comes to workforce development for a very long time. Certainly not nearly as much as some of our competitors. Sweden, Germany, Singapore just started an innovative program where they're giving people lifelong training accounts. I was reading the report from Aspen last night, and it's a terrific report, and it's filled with so many great ideas. And it's filled with so many great ideas that never went anywhere. It's legislation that was proposed but never passed, programs that were proposed but never funded. So what is the right role for the federal government in these questions?
I think one of the challenges that you have with education and putting workforce training in that bucket is that that's where federalism challenges us, right? Because traditionally, education is a state and local function. We take a look at education. The federal government monitors, you look at Title I, that's where we can fill in. And there hasn't been the appropriate level of collaboration between state and local entities and business entities and I think the federal government. One of the couple things in terms of focus. The first thing is it's too disparate. The federal training and apprenticeship programs are not collaborated, they're not coordinated. Every agency says, oh, we're gonna have a training program or we're gonna have this. Take a look at the VA. The VA does some incredible work, but it's not well coordinated across the board with state and local entities. And so they don't frequently know what those benefits are, what those training programs are. So we've gotta have a major focus on centralizing workforce development and training within the federal government. You have to own it, and then the committees have to own it, right? So if every individual committee has some little piece of training, that's not gonna lead to success. It's gonna lead to unproductive and inefficient competition for federal dollars in training. So centralize the federal training programs, whether it's at Job Service, whether it's Department of Labor, wherever the Department of Education, quit piecing it out. Bring it all together. Then you need a tax code that's going to recognize corporate investment in people the same way we recognize corporate investment in steel, right? That tools always will get the benefit in the tax code as opposed to people who use those tools. We've got to reinvest. And the one thing that's never talked about, that I will die on this hill, if you want workforce training, you got to train a workforce to train. So, Microsoft's in the audience. One of the things that we've done at Microsoft, North Dakota has the third largest Microsoft facility in the country. And they recognize that if they're going to be successful in North Dakota, they need to build a group of people who will do technology, who will major in technology. I've gone to many, many school groups and asked them, how many of you are going to be coders? No one raises their hand. You know what? They're all going to be coders, right? It's like, seriously, if you ask people my age, how many of you need to know how to use a keyboard? We'd all say, well, yeah. I mean, we all grew up with that training. This is the kind of training, but we don't have a training workforce in North Dakota to train and to open people's minds to that kind of technology. And that's why Microsoft's involvement with the education system in North Dakota to build out the ability to train trainers is so critical. But it shouldn't be that haphazard, and it shouldn't be that one good idea. We've got to get people who will weld. I give you just an idea. If you're a welder in North Dakota and you're good at it, you're going to make $150,000 a year. You aren't going to live a lifestyle that a lot of you would want to live because you're going to travel. If you're a Boilermaker, right? You're going to travel all over the country, but you're going to make $150,000 a year. You convince that guy who's a welder that he should take a job at $50,000 training new welders. He can't afford it. So why aren't we paying him $150,000 if he's a great welder to train welders? Why aren't we paying somebody $200,000 to come into the high schools and train people to code? Why aren't we investing in a training workforce that is going to drive opportunity? Because when kids are exposed to it in high school, guess what? They're going to say, that's something I'm interested in. That's something I'm going to do. The Microsoft program, and it would be great to get the numbers, but the number of people who have gone through there where I've asked them, is this something you're thinking about doing now in college? It's almost 100% once they're exposed to it. So great for Microsoft, great for IBM, but it can't be haphazard and it can't be catch as catch can. We need a unified program to train the trainers.
Congresswoman?
Yeah, I was going to say, allow me to jump in because there's a couple points I'd like to make. First, I'd actually like to kick this back to all of you in the audience because many of you are catalyzers of this dialogue in the public policy considerations. And I think we want to be very specific about the problems that we are addressing and how we define the problem. First, on the future of work. When I started off in this advanced manufacturing research lab focused on the Internet of Things and digital manufacturing, and I had this multi-million-dollar portfolio saying, go create workforce development initiatives, go create job training programs. The conversation that was taking place in arenas like this was that all the jobs were going away. Take truck driving as an example. We have been hysterical about truck driving, convinced that every truck driving job is going to be gone. But yet, our reality is that there are not enough truck drivers to take the jobs available. And so we have a skills gap or a job problem in truck driving. And we have this conversation on a multitude of levels with a multitude of problems. You know, the future is a grand luxury. Now, we all have experienced the future today, as it comes at us pretty rapidly in the 21st century. We've witnessed the creation of global companies almost overnight, like the Ubers of our economy. But I think we've got to be laser focused on what's right before us, which are our skills gap. We have a skills gap in advanced manufacturing. It's an uptake of over 500,000 open manufacturing jobs. We need to be doing exactly what the senator just declared, which is supporting the trainers, doing the training of the trainer if we have the need to do that. But we also really need to be putting our money where our mouth is, which is why I'm so proud of programs like the Manufacturing Extension Partnership Centers that do this with our suppliers and join forces. I think that is more than an imperative for us, which is to continue to support those federal initiatives. The interagency coordination is also paramount to us. The right hand and the left hand need to be talking to one another, and we have to stop focusing on the random acts of excellence. So let me go back to my lab days. With my program, I thought, you know, there's all sorts of great job training initiatives out there, lots of great programs trying to inspire the next generation. We don't need another random act of excellence. What we need to do is find unprecedented value. And so set forward, created a national workforce development advisory committee in this future of workspace with a lot of the big companies, some of the small, some of our universities. And I convinced Manpower Group to work with us, a job placement agency. We convinced Manpower Group to work with us, scratching our heads around how we're defining the future of work and what we're really looking at. And Manpower, with all their unprecedented data, in partnership with our OEMs, codified 20 unique job profiles in the digital manufacturing space, declaring, aha, all the jobs aren't going away. We doubled down and we said, okay, well, why don't we do meeting them where they're at, the on-the-job training work, which you can do through online mechanisms, right? We live in a self-directed learning economy. We've all lived it. We've all seen it in our careers. You've learned as you've gone, or you wouldn't be in the workplace today. So online job training programs are really successful, not when it's a build it and you think they will come mechanism, but when you embed it with a company or an organization or a community college. We have to continue to foster collaboration and partnership and unlikely alliances, which is why I'm so dead set on bringing labor into the conversation, because they are a best practice and they have been left out of the conversation for far too long. Thank you.
I want to open it up in our last few minutes. I think we have time for one or two questions. There are microphones coming around.
I'm Shane Kennedy. I work at Source America, and we focus on employment for persons with disabilities. So thank you for your presentations this morning. I was just wondering, the social and economic imperative of including people with disabilities in this conversation, how do we ensure from a policymaker perspective that the over 70% of people who are out of the labor market that are individuals with disabilities are part of this national dialogue?
There are so many opportunities to include the disability community in these workforce development opportunities. When we look at the IoT landscape, the multi-trillion-dollar industry or economy that it's going to become, it shouldn't leave anybody behind. And in fact, it's ripe for the taking of often overlooked communities. There's a company that I've had the privilege of working with called Op Solutions, and they do light-guided parts assembly. And we've partnered to bring this to certain disability communities, in part because light-guided parts assembly, HP Sprout technology matched with customized parts assembly, you can do it in your home. You can do it in different job training centers, and it trains and it educates. So as we look to make these investments, we absolutely need to include you in the conversation. So thank you.
And Senator, you've looked at labor force participation.
Absolutely, and when you look at the numbers, that's one of the great challenges that we have, getting more people back into the workforce, whether it's young moms, young dads, or the disabled community. And we have a great center, it's called the Carlson Center. There's a young man there who's won numerous awards on doing adaptive kinds of technologies that can really increase the opportunity for the disabled community. So we've got to look at what the barriers are to entry for the disabled community, and then how do we make investments to make sure that we're using the full capacity of America's workforce. And so I would say, we need to make a commitment, but we also need to understand that there are new tools that will provide incredible opportunities for the disabled community to participate in the workforce like they never have. And we need to invest in those tools, which is good not just for them, but it's also good for America when we can increase our workforce participation.
Okay. Over here, the woman in the front here.
Hi, my name is Allison Lands, and I lead the Economic Mobility Practice at the Center for Public Impact. And my question is for Congresswoman Stevens.
Yeah.
Before, you were talking about apprenticeship programs that were being done in your district, and you mentioned that they were being done the right way, that the Department of Labor wasn't even involved. I would love to hear our research at the Center for Public Impact has focused a lot on the role of government versus employers. Versus educators, and I'd love to hear both of your thoughts on what the appropriate role for state and federal government is here and how employers may need to lean in.
Right. Well, allow me to clarify that there was nothing more significant than doing WIOA and supporting what has been a public policy vision for a long time, and new approaches to apprenticeship and job training initiatives that also empower employers. I think what I would encourage you to study, and this is somebody who is in the New Dem Coalition in the House of Representatives and a co-chair of the Future of Work Task Force, and it's part of our charge, which is looking at what our labor unions are doing in terms of apprenticeship and job training programs. It's important because they're not drawing down on federal monies because they don't need to. They're self-sustaining. They've cracked the code. They're training individuals for the jobs that are available, and the way that their payment scheme works, it's low cost for the individuals going through it. They get a credential at the end. What's missing is this integration work. Well, why can't I get a community college credit? Why can't it be a stepping stone to a degree? And I think, given where you sit and the work that you do, you are in a very unique place to kind of awaken that conversation and take a broader look at what we are doing in places like southeastern Michigan that are working very well. There's also a lot of apprenticeship programs that have started because of WIOA, and they also shouldn't be overlooked. President Obama's Manufacturing USA initiative that localized R&D, did the tech transfer, and also prioritized workforce development is another best practice. There are dozens of these Manufacturing USA centers throughout the country in various research concentrations, helping us do what the senator just mentioned, which is leading the charge in a competitive and ever-changing global landscape. We are in the race for the future. We all know that. I think it's ours for the taking.
I think when you look at centralization, some people would look at that as, it doesn't bubble up the innovation. But we're now at that point where we need to have one centralized initiative. Number one, it's more approachable for the worker to understand this is the program. When you have people, we're gonna have a major initiative now on Perkins, we're gonna have a major initiative on manufacturing workers, we're gonna talk about AI over here, talk about here. This needs to be wrapped together so it's so much more accessible, and it needs to be federal, state, private partnerships. And it needs to be locally driven. And this confusion around the bright, shiny object, this is Washington, D.C. It's the squirrel play. Squirrel. Right? You know the movie Up, right? Squirrel. If you want to get the dogs off your back, yell squirrel. And everybody kind of looks at the bright, shiny object of the day, whether that's AI or whether it's the future of work. Guess what? There needs to be systemic commitment. And it can't just be one-off. It's got to be consistent with recommendations that we hold. As Lauren said, there's great recommendations in here. Why aren't we doing them? Because there's no level of accountability. There's no centralization of this dialogue. And that's why with the work that Aspen's doing, with a lot of help from foundations, and this is something that Mark Warner introduced me to. That's how I got involved in this initiative, because people who are really thinking about the future of our economy know we can't do it by leaving workers behind.
I think we have time for one more quick question. Yes, woman in the middle.
My name is Becca Raley, and I work at the Partnership for Better Health. We're a small community foundation based in rural central Pennsylvania. We have a local coalition of community leaders and stakeholders who care a whole lot about these issues. And it feels like in our universe, we're surrounded by people stuck in crap jobs, from our school aides, to our retail workers, to our restaurant workers, to our nursing assistants. It's just so much of that, and so many emergency services to try to support those folks who just can't even make it today. So it seems like a large swath of our economy. To your point about working at the local level, what can we be doing to move our community forward?
Well, first off, I say this every time I talk about work. What's the toughest job in America? You might think it's being CEO of Goldman Sachs. I don't think so. They seem to live pretty well, right? Toughest job in America is being a CNA in a nursing home, in my opinion. And that's not a crap job, that's an essential job. We need to start understanding that we have to pay workers for the quality and for the value of their work. And so let's just start out by saying we're gonna need waitresses, we're gonna need CNAs, we're gonna need all those people that you just described. We need to improve their economic conditions. Many of them work in kind of places where the investment is capped. Medicaid will cap how much they'll spend per day per resident. The nursing homes aren't necessarily getting rich. And so we haven't appropriately assigned the right kind of value to that work. And how we try and equalize that is through the earned income tax credit, right? Through things like minimum wage and the earned income tax credit. And so let's not say we're gonna, these are dead-end jobs or inappropriate jobs. They're jobs that are undervalued economically in our economy. And that is a systemic and challenge that we haven't even addressed here. So move beyond that and say, let's say that CNA wants to become an RN, right? He or she has that goal. How do we embed that kind of training so that we have a huge shortage of RNs. We have a huge shortage of mental health workers. How do we get people to work and transition? A major initiative where we can plug in those voids, those workforce voids, and work with the local entity to either provide online training or to do digital training. There's tons of new developments in educational availability that we haven't even tapped into because we're too busy fighting last century's fight. And so I would say first thing we need to do is pay those people more.
The only other thing I would add to that is that it is highly significant that you are here today and you are benefiting your community by taking the step and participating in this dialogue in the nation's capital, where so much of the answer does hit our desk in terms of how we're going to address the minimum wage and how we're going to finally get the expansion of the earned income tax credit that is long overdue and very necessary to this conversation. Yeah, go ahead,
And one other idea, how about we close the gap on Social Security tax, right? Our 6.2. We actually make people who make more pay more, and we forgive the first $50,000 of income. That puts 6.2, not for the employer, but for the employee. That puts 6.2% of their income back into their pocket. What does that do for economic growth? How about we have that conversation?
She's saying that too because I'm in the House,
Yeah.
and we're working on that bill. So
Yeah.
it's
So
highly significant. But
Right.
how do we put more money in people's pocketbooks? And how do we, and again, to put it back into the audience about how we are talking about these jobs, we shouldn't be talking about them as, oh, that's just something that you do for a little bit of time in your life or this or that. No. The essential jobs that people are doing have to meet their value. Look what happened in this country with our educators. We in Michigan are struggling. I represent the best schools in the state, and yet I run a teacher shortage. You tell me why. It's because my teachers haven't gotten a raise in 10 years. So, in terms of how we smartly do this and have these keep jumping in, Heidi. You
No,
got
I
all the policy
was just
ideas.
going to say
We do need to
that.
wrap
I was just
shortly.
going to say you've got the future of work. We should also be talking about the value of work.
Yes.
Both the human value and the monetary value of work. And what is the contribution to society, and how do we compensate that contribution to society? Because we're pretty skewed right now in this country.
Thank your coffee maker. Thank your RN. Seriously. Starts with that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This has been a great conversation.
Thank you.